Hello, in this video we are talking about, in my opinion, one of the most underrated lenses from Canon. This is the EF 24mm f2.8 prime lens for both full frame and APS-C sensors with image stabilization. But for most people this lens is not very exciting. However, by the end of this video I am certain that you will see for yourself that this tiny little lens from Canon is really quite a gem in Canon EF's lineup. We are going to go over the advantages of using this lens for both filmmaking and photography. So let's start by taking a look at the build quality, shall we? Alright, so as you have seen in this little intro sequence, this lens is very well built. It has a metal mount right here in the rear and is also very sturdy. It feels good in the hand, it's not too light, it doesn't feel plasticky at all. Everything fits inside really well, and if I turn the ring, this is the focusing ring, it turns nicely and smoothly. It's very well dampened and it's very easy to use this ring in order to manually focus this lens. It has two switches on the side. One of it is to switch from autofocus to manual focus, and the other is to turn on or off the optical image stabilization that is built in inside this lens. So overall, this lens really looks and feels great. And I have mentioned at the beginning of this video that this is a very underrated lens, because for most people this lens is not exciting. And why is it not exciting? Because it's a prime fixed focal length lens, which means it doesn't zoom in and out. It has only one constant focal length, and the focal length is 24mm, and the 24mm is kind of a focal length that really exists in most of the focal ranges of the zoom lenses that you might get with your camera on a kit lens. Because if you're buying a full frame camera, chances are that the lens that comes with a kit, if you're buying a kit with both the body and the lens, is going to be something around either 24-70 or maybe 24-105. But typically it starts at 24mm focal length, and getting this lens is kind of doubling the existing focal length that you can already pull off with your zoom lens. So why would you want to buy a prime lens with the same focal length that you already have on your zoom? Well, if you're an advanced user, you may appreciate having a prime lens, because usually prime lenses have overall better image quality and better optical performance in terms of aberrations, in terms of sharpness, vignetting, etc, etc. But most importantly, usually prime lenses are characterized by their wide aperture, definitely wider and bigger than their zoom counterparts. So a lot of people are buying either a 50mm prime lens or an 85mm prime lens. Those two focal lengths are really great for portraits, and a lot of brands, including Canon, are making fantastic lenses, fantastic prime lenses with those focal lengths with apertures like f2.0, f1.8, f1.4 even, or even f1.2, which is a huge aperture which provides a lot of bokeh, really shallow depth of field, which is desirable for portraiture. And that's why most people choose prime lenses, for their wider apertures and for their better optical performance. But this lens has the aperture of only f2.8, and this is not particularly fast for a prime lens. A lot of zoom lenses, for instance from Canon, you have the option to buy a 24-70 f2.8 constant aperture lens, and this lens is fantastic. It also has 2.8 aperture, it also has the 24mm focal length in its zoom range. So why would you want to get this lens? Well, let me get into the advantages of this lens. So first, let's talk about it from the perspective of a filmmaker. Alright, so first of all, the advantage of using a lens like this is the fact that it is really compact, really small, and really lightweight. If you are into vlogging and you slap it onto your camera, you're basically looking at a camera with this kind of footprint. It's really small, it's really easy to hold at arm's length if you are vlogging. And if you slap on, for instance, a Tamron 15-30 or Canon 16-35 or something like this, these lenses are huge, they're very long, they're very heavy, and it is, it is exhausting, it is physically tiring to hold a camera like this with a huge and heavy lens. Your arm is getting really tired, and the whole vlogging experience is just not fun at all compared to having a small tiny lens like this. Also, if you have a small lens, it's very easy to balance it on a gimbal, because with some gimbals it is even not possible to balance a camera like the EOS R that I'm shooting on right now with the adapter and with, for instance, the Canon 16 to 35 zoom lens, it is just not possible because this lens is just too large and too front heavy. So you may have a lot of hard time balancing a lens like this on a gimbal, whereas if you have a tiny little prime lens like this, balancing it on a gimbal would be a breeze. And like I mentioned before, let's take it off. Like I mentioned before, this lens has a USM motor, which means that it is not the most silent of autofocusing motors that Canon has to offer. Definitely the STM autofocusing motor is a little bit more silent, but USM is definitely very quiet. For instance, compared to a autofocusing motor on Tokina lenses that I was using before, man, those lenses were so loud. I had to use an extender on top of my shotgun mic. I actually have a whole video about that. You can check it out right here. But this lens with the USM motor is very quiet, and also the advantage of having a short lens when it comes to the noises of the autofocusing motor is that, let's put it on again, is that if you have a shotgun mic here and it is kind of, you know, it starts here and it goes like this, then if you have a short lens, that the lens is sort of before the microphone ends. And if you have a very long lens, that means that the lens's internal mechanics are actually laying more in front of the microphone. So the noises that a long lens produces would be much more picked up by a shotgun mic than compared to a small, very short lens like this one. So this definitely gives you an edge. And also the USM motor is very easy to work with if you want to focus manually. And you know, for video work, if you're a little bit of an advanced user, you may want to focus manually. You may want to do what is called a focus pulling, which means transitioning from one focal plane to another focal plane. And if you have a USM motor in a lens like this one, you actually have this little screen which tells you what is the distance to your focal plane. So it is really easy to do a reliable focus pull and repeatedly pull focus from one distance to another using this type of focusing system. And when it comes to the maximum aperture of this lens, I think f2.8 is definitely a good enough aperture for video work. Actually, most filmmakers would shoot at the aperture of like 3.5 or even 4. It is not recommended to use an extremely large apertures because it kind of looks weird and unnatural. So f2.8 is definitely a bright enough aperture for like vlogging or for recording videos like this for YouTube. f2.8 is definitely enough. We're gonna go outside in just a second so I can show you the vlogging kind of example, and you will see how the f2.8 bokeh looks in the background behind me. But before we do that, I just wanted to mention one last thing, which is that if you are a YouTuber or someone who records videos sitting at a desk, for instance, like I sit right here, most of the videos I shoot in this particular setup, I actually filmed using this lens, which is the 24mm prime. Currently, I'm not shooting on it because this lens is in my hand, obviously, but I'm shooting on a 15mm with the 1.6 movie cropping mode on the EOS R, which turns out to be exactly 24mm equivalent when it comes to the field of view. So you can see that this field of view is very natural. It provides the medium shot kind of look. It's not too wide. And if you have a too wide lens, your head will get warped up if you move to the corners of the frame. So I think 24mm provide a very good, very natural field of view, and it's also not too close with my face jammed up to the camera, so you can show products, you can show stuff. If you're a YouTuber, definitely 24mm is, in my opinion, a perfect focal length to have the camera on your desk. You have access to your laptop or something like this. It's sweet. So okay, let's go outside now and let me show you how this lens behaves in a vlogging situation. Alright, so we are outside and I am currently just holding the camera on a GorillaPod. I am literally just holding the camera at arm's length, as you can see right now. And look at the framing. The framing looks really nice and it's not too wide. Again, like I mentioned, it is also not too tight. I think the 24mm is really perfect for vlogging if you just want to talk to the camera and maybe show off a little bit of the environment. And I'm using the image stabilization in the lens. Again, I am not using an IBIS on my camera because I don't have IBIS on my EOS R, and I think the image looks pretty natural, pretty good. There is no wobbliness on the sides from a warp stabilizer in post-production. Everything looks nice and natural. And right now I have switched the image stabilization in the lens off, so you should probably see a difference. Definitely there are this more micro jitter and micro movements on the sides when I'm walking, so the image stabilization really helps out. Let me just turn it on quickly. Alright, and it is back on. I am using the IAF autofocusing method on my camera, so if I move closer and further away, hopefully the camera would refocus on my face and I'm not hearing any noises from the autofocusing motor picked up by the microphone. Do you hear anything? I'm using the Rode Video Micro shotgun mic, so like I said, the audio with this lens, even with using the autofocusing motor, is really sweet, and the autofocusing actions are really not audible when using a shotgun mic on top of the camera. By the end of this video, I will also show you some sample images taken with this particular lens, so make sure to stick around till the end of the video. But right now, let's go back to the studio and let's talk about some photography advantages of using this lens. Alright, so we are back at the studio, and if you are doing filmmaking, then you should probably be already convinced that the 24mm prime f2.8 with image stabilization from Canon, this little lens right here, is a fantastic lens for video work. So right now, let's talk about some of the features from a photography standpoint. So like I mentioned before, the advantage of having a small lens is of course that it is just easy and it is very pleasant to walk around with a lens like this. If you have a neck strap and a camera on your neck, if you have a small lens, it's going to be easier to walk around with your camera for longer periods of time. Whereas if you have a very long and very heavy lens, it's going to get uncomfortable with the camera dangling somewhere here. It's just not going to be as comfortable as with working with a small lens. And also, if you have a small lens like this, and for instance you're doing astrophotography on a star tracker, which is also a big part of my YouTube channel, I have a lot of videos about that, you can check them out later in the description. But if you are balancing a camera with a lens on a star tracker, then having a small and lightweight lens definitely gives you an advantage that the star tracker will be easier to balance. It will work for longer periods of time because the batteries will not be drained as much as with having to rotate a heavy camera. So that's the obvious advantage of having a small lens. And the 24mm I think is actually a perfect focal length, for instance, for Milky Way photography. Take a look at this image, for instance. This was shot with this particular lens at 24mm focal length. It's not a panorama, anything like this. It's a single frame and the Milky Way looks beautiful. It's not too wide, because if the shot is too wide, in my opinion, the Milky Way loses its prominence in the shot. I think it should be big enough to be like the main thing that you look in a shot like this. And also it cannot be too tight because the Milky Way is huge and you typically want to show off the vastness of the Milky Way with relation to the landscape. So I think 24mm is perfect for astrophotography. The f2.8, it could be faster for astrophotography, but again, if you're using a tracker, it doesn't really matter. You can get great results at f2.8, f4 even, or whatnot if you're using a tracker. And also, I personally think that the 24mm focal length is also perfect for landscape photography, street photography, urban photography, cityscapes, and shots like this. 2 years ago, I was on a trip to New York City and I had my previous camera, which was the Canon 77D, and I had a prime 16mm f2.0 lens from Samyang, which was by the way even a manual focus lens, and I was walking around with this lens and also my kit zoom lens, and I think 99% of the shots I took was with the Samyang 16mm. And take a look at some of those shots. You can see the variety of shots you can get with this kind of focal length, and the 16mm on an IPS-C camera is roughly an equivalent of 25mm on a full-frame camera. So compared to a 24mm, it's pretty much the same angle of view, and you can see how cool shots you can get doing street photography with this particular focal length. And you might say, well, if I have a zoom lens that also zooms out to 24, I can get those same shots, but it maybe is a little bit more versatile because I can zoom in. And yes, that is actually true, but especially if you're a beginner or maybe you're just starting out doing more serious photography, then having a prime lens is something that limits you, but it actually elevates you in your creativity, because instead of just standing in the same spot and zooming in and out, it actually forces you to move with your feet, and that will allow you to, for instance, look and maybe find a cooler perspective, maybe some foreground object that you can use in order to spice up your framing. And typically it can only lead to good things and improve your overall photography. And if you are worried that, for instance, a old lens like this, because this lens was originally announced in 2012, I think, so it's already 8 years old now in 2020, and if you're worried that the optical performance of this lens might be subpar compared to the more modern lenses, well, I actually have tested this particular lens with a Canon RF 24-70 f2.8 IS lens, which is fairly new for the mirrorless R series lineup, and guess what? This lens is producing sharper images. Here, let me prove that to you. Alright, so we are here in Lightroom and I have this comparison shot. The same shot, it has the same exact composition, both were shot using the 24mm focal length, same shutter speed, same aperture, same ISO, and pretty much the same framing. And if I zoom in into the center, you can see that on the left you have the RF 24-70 and on the right you have the EF 24 prime. And look at that. Look at this sign, for instance, the number 7 and this little text here. this text is actually a lot sharper using the EF24 prime lens. And if I zoom out and for instance zoom into the corners, you can see that the corners are very sharp as well, even wide open at f2.8. It is a little less sharpened, but this is perfectly natural for any lens in particular. And you can see this lens really holds up. If I look at this corner, for instance, let's take a look at those three vertical sort of lines here on this pillar. You can see that the EF24 prime lens is also sharper here in the corner. So overall, I was really amazed to find out that the old 8 years old prime lens from Canon is producing sharper images than the new and shiny RF24-70. And yes, of course, sharpness is not everything when it comes to photography, but you can see that if you're worried that if you're using an old lens like this, which is not even an L series lens, you might get soft images. It is absolutely not true. This lens is a beast when it comes to sharpness. And the fact that this lens also has image stabilization is a great thing, because you can go down to shutter speeds like 1/5 of a second, maybe 1/3 of a second, even if you're shooting a sunset and then you're losing light, you're going into the twilight area of the day. Then you can use this lens with the image stabilization. They claim that the image stabilization on this lens provides up to 4 stops of stabilization, so you really can get great sharp looking photos using lower ISOs, so our images are cleaner. So the image stabilization for photography is also a great addition on this lens. And I think that the maximum aperture of f2.8 is also wide enough to get a very decent, very nice looking out of focus areas. It's not going to be as much of the bokeh as using even wider apertures like 1.8 or something, but it's definitely enough to produce a very pleasing, very professional looking images. And lastly, going back to astrophotography, the fact that this lens has a USM motor makes it very easy to use this rig in order to focus manually on the stars at night. I was previously struggling using an STM lens. When I was starting out with astrophotography, I was really stumped about how am I supposed to use an STM motor with no display or whatever. The ring can just turn around infinitely without any stop. And using this lens, if you are a beginner, of course it's doable on STM lenses as well, but if you are a beginner in astrophotography, having a dial, having this little display showing you what is the distance to your focal plane, and of course there's the infinity marking right here. So you will have much easier time starting out focusing manually on the stars for astrophotography using this lens. And of course, the price of this lens, it is way cheaper than the aforementioned RF24-70, for instance, for Canon R series mirrorless cameras. That lens costs more than $2,000, which is ridiculously pricey. And this little lens, when it launched, it was priced at $800, but currently I think it costs something around $600, maybe $550. You can check for yourself. Go into the description of this video, you will find a link to Amazon to this particular lens. Also, I saw that there are a lot of deals to get this lens used or maybe in a very good condition, even cheaper than $600. So definitely check out the link in the description if you are going to pick up a lens, this particular lens. And also, I have a bunch of links in the description to all the gear that I use on a daily basis, my EOS R camera, my other lenses, video lights, USB microphones, USB drives and stuff like this, drones. So just go to the description and you'll probably find some interesting stuff there for you to pick up if you're on the market for that, of course. And that's basically it for me for this video. I hope I convinced you that it is worth getting this lens for both filmmaking and photography. Just to recap, the small and lightweight size of this lens gives an advantage if you are trying to use this lens with a gimbal or an astro tracker. It's easy to walk around. It's very easy to vlog with this lens because it's lightweight. Your arm will not get tired as much as with using a ultra-wide zoom lens. The focal length on this lens is perfect for desk recordings. It's perfect for vlogging. The image stabilization is a great help if you're using a body without IBIS like the Canon EOS R. And if you're using a body with IBIS like the new R5 or R6, then having a lens with stabilization will give you an even better footage. So you really cannot go wrong with this lens. If you like this video, make sure to leave it a thumbs up down below. It would really help me out. Also, leave a comment down below if you have any questions. I pretty much try to answer every single question I get on YouTube, so just don't hesitate and ask away. And also consider subscribing to the channel because there will be a lot more videos like this. And I, on my channel, cover a lot of things related to photography and filmmaking, tutorials, post-processing tutorials, etc. So check out my channel. You can probably find something interesting in there. And right now, if you want to check out my other gear reviews, lenses or cameras, click on the playlist right here. If you want to check out my tips and tutorials playlist, click on the playlist right here. And click here in order to subscribe to my channel to don't miss out on future videos like I mentioned. But that's it for now. Have a good day. See you next time and bye bye.